The foreword of The Iron Heel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. The foreword of The Iron Heel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matt Soar. The Iron Heel by Jack London. Foreword. At first, this earth, a stage so gloomed with woe, you almost sicken at the shifting of the scenes. And yet, be patient. Our playwright may show in some fifth act what this wild drama means. It cannot be said that the Everhard manuscript is an important historical document. To the historian, it bristles with errors, not errors of fact, but errors of interpretation. Looking back across the 7 centuries that have lapsed since Avis Everhard completed her manuscript, events, and the bearings of events that were confused and veiled to her, are clear to us. She lacked perspective. She was too close to the events she writes about. Nay, she was merged in the events she has described. Nevertheless, as a personal document, the Everhard manuscript is of inestimable value. But here again enter error of perspective and vitiation due to the bias of love. Yet we smile, indeed, and forgive Avis Everhard for the heroic lines upon which she modeled her husband. We know today that he was not so colossal, and that he loomed among the events of his times less largely than the manuscript would lead us to believe. We know that Ernest Everhard was an exceptionally strong man, but not so exceptional as his wife thought him to be. He was, after all, but one of a large number of heroes who throughout the world devoted their lives to the revolution, though it must be conceded that he did unusual work, especially in his elaboration and interpretation of working-class philosophy. Proletarian science and proletarian philosophy were his phrases for it, and therein he shows the provincialism of his mind, a defect, however, that was due to the times, and that none in that day could escape. But to return to the manuscript. Especially valuable is it in communicating to us the feel of those terrible times. Nowhere do we find more vividly portrayed the psychology of the persons that lived in that turbulent period embraced between the years 1912 and 1932, their mistakes and ignorance, their doubts and fears and misapprehensions, their ethical delusions, their violent passions, their inconceivable sordidness and selfishness. These are the things that are so hard for us of this enlightened age to understand. History tells us that these things were, and biology and psychology tell us why they were. But history and biology and psychology do not make these things alive. We accept them as facts, but we are left without sympathetic comprehension of them. This sympathy comes to us, however, as we peruse the Everhard manuscript. We enter into the minds of the actors in that long-ago world drama, and for the time being their mental processes are our mental processes. Not alone do we understand Avis Everhard's love for her hero husband, but we feel, as he felt in those first days, the vague and terrible loom of the oligarchy. The iron heel, well named, we feel descending upon and crushing mankind. And in passing, we note that that historic phrase, the iron heel, originated in Ernest Everhard's mind. This, we may say, is the one moot question that this newfound document clears up. Previous to this, the earliest known use of the phrase occurred in the pamphlet Ye Slaves, written by George Milford and published in December 1912. This George Milford was an obscure agitator about whom nothing is known, save the one additional bit of information gained from the manuscript, which mentions that he was shot in the Chicago Commune. Evidently, he had heard Ernest Everhard make use of the phrase in some public speech, most probably when he was running for Congress in the fall of 1912. From the manuscript, we learn that Everhard used the phrase at a private dinner in the spring of 1912. This is, without discussion, the earliest known occasion on which the oligarchy was so designated. The rise of the oligarchy will always remain a cause of secret wonder to the historian and the philosopher. Other great historical events have their place in social evolution. They were inevitable. Their coming could have been predicted with the same certitude that astronomers today predict the outcome of the movements of stars. Without these other great historical events, social evolution could not have proceeded. Primitive communism, chattel slavery, serf slavery, and wage slavery were necessary stepping stones in the evolution of society. But it were ridiculous to assert that the iron heel was a necessary stepping stone. Rather, today it is adjudged a step aside or a step backward to the social tyrannies that made the early word a hell. But the word necessary as the iron heel slavery, serf slavery, and wage slavery. Black as feudalism was, yet the coming of it was inevitable. What else than feudalism could have followed upon the breakdown of that great centralized government machine known as the Roman Empire? It is adjudged a not so, however, with the iron heel. In the orderly procedure of social evolution, there was no place for it. It was not necessary, and it was not inevitable. But the word necessary must always remain a great curiosity of history, a whim, a fantasy. What else than feudalism could have followed upon the breakdown of that great centralized government machine? And it should serve as a warning to those rash political theorists of today as the Roman Empire judged not so, however, with the iron heel. Can the orderly was adjudged by the sociologists of the time to be the culmination of bourgeois rule, the ripened fruit of the bourgeois revolution. The procedure of social evolution, there was no place for that judgment. It was not necessary, and it was not inevitable. It was held, even by such intellectual and antagonistic giants as Herbert Spencer, a whim that socialism would come out of the decay of self-seeking capitalism that was held, would arise that flower of the ages, the brotherhood of man, instead of which, appalling alike to us who look back and to those that lived at that time, capitalism, rotten ripe, sent forth that monstrous offshoot, the oligarchy. Too late did the socialist movement of the early 20th century divine the coming of the oligarchy. Even as it was divined, the oligarchy was there, a fact established in blood, a stupendous and awful reality. Nor even then, as the Everhard manuscript well shows, was any permanence attributed to the Iron Heel. Its overthrow was a matter of a few short years, or was the judgment of the revolutionists at his feet, waved his arms, they for a moment could utter only incoherent sounds, and that the first revolt was speech poured from him. But it was not the speech of a $100,000 lawyer, nor was the rhetoric old-fashioned. More terrible punishment. It is apparent that Avis Everhard
upon fallacy.
The manuscript during the last days.
Never in all my life have I heard so many fallacies uttered in one short hour. And besides, young man, I must tell you that you have said nothing new. I learned all that at college before you were born. Jean-Jacques Rousseau enunciated your socialistic theory nearly 2 centuries ago. A return to the soil, forsooth. Reversion. Our biology teaches the absurdity of it. It has been truly said that a little learning is a dangerous thing, and you have exemplified it tonight with your madcap theories. Fallacy upon fallacy. I was never so nauseated in my life with overplots of fallacy. That, for your immature generalizations and childish reasonings.
And as is well known, no record of such executions was kept by the Iron Heel. But little did she realize, exclamations of approval on the part of the women, the manuscript, coarser notes of confirmation, terrible men in the breakdown of the. As for the dozen men who were clamoring for the floor, half of them began tortuous and distorted. The confusion and babble was indescribable. Never had a person with spacious walls beheld such a spectacle. Drowned these then were the cool captains of industry and lords of society. These snarling, growling savages in evening clothes. Truly, Ernest had shaken them when he stretched out his hands for their money bags. His hands disturbed in the heart of the centralized government machine, and it should serve as a warning to those rash political theorists. Captains of industry and lords of society, these snarling, growling savages in evening clothes. Truly, Ernest had shaken them when he stretched out his hands for their money bags. His hands disturbed. Recording by Matt Soar, Montreal, and it should serve as a warning to those rash political theorists. Captains of industry and lords of society, these snarling, growling savages. Chapter 1 of The Iron Heel by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
His hands disturbed.
Recording by Matt Soar, Montreal, mysoar.org. The soft summer wind stirs the redwoods, and wild water ripples. Sweet Chapter 1 over at The Iron Heel by Jack London. There are butterflies in the sunshine, and from everywhere arises the drowsy hum of bees. It is so quiet and peaceful, and I sit here and ponder, and am restless. It is the quiet that makes me restless. It seems unreal. All the world is quiet, but it is the quiet before the storm. I strain my ears and all my senses for some betrayal of that impending storm. Oh, that it may not be premature. That it may not be premature. The second revolt was largely the work of Ernest Everhard, though he cooperated, of course, with the European leaders. The capture and secret execution of Everhard was the great event of the spring of 1932 A.D. Yet so thoroughly had he prepared for the revolt that his fellow conspirators were able, with little confusion or delay, to carry out his plans. It was after Everhard's execution that his wife went to Wake Robin Lodge, a small bungalow in the Sonoma Hills of California. Small wonder that I am restless. I think, and I cannot cease from thinking. I have been in the thick of life so long that I am oppressed by the peace and quiet, and I cannot forbear from dwelling upon that mad maelstrom of death and destruction so soon to burst forth. In my ears are the cries of the stricken, and I can see, as I have seen in the past, all the marring and mangling of the sweet, beautiful flesh, and the souls torn with violence. Soft summer wind stirs the redwoods, and wild water ripples. Chapter 1 over at the Iron Heel, carnage and destruction. There are butterflies in the sunhappiness upon the earth. Without doubt, she here refers to the Chicago Commune. And then I am lonely. When I do not think of what is to come, I think of what has been and is no more. My eagle, beating with tireless wings the void, soaring toward what was ever his sun, the flaming ideal of human freedom. I cannot sit idly by and wait the great event that is his making, though he is not here to see. He devoted all the years of his manhood to it, and for it he gave his life. It is his handiwork. He made it. With all respect to Avis Everhard, it must be pointed out that Everhard was but one of many able leaders who planned the Second Revolt, and we, today, looking back across the centuries, can safely say that even had he lived, the Second Revolt would not have been less calamitous in its outcome than it was. And so it is in this anxious time of waiting that I shall write of my husband. There is much light that I alone of all persons living can throw upon his character, and so noble a character cannot be blazoned forth too brightly. His was a great soul, and when my love grows unselfish, my chiefest regret is that he is not here to witness tomorrow's dawn. We cannot fail. He has built too stoutly and too surely for that. Woe to the iron heel. Soon shall it be thrust back from off prostrate humanity. When the word goes forth, the labor hosts of all the world shall rise. There has been nothing like it in the history of the world. The solidarity of labor is assured, and for the first time will there be an international revolution, wide as the world is wide. The Second Revolt was truly international. It was a colossal plan, too colossal to be wrought by the genius of one man alone. Labor in all the oligarchies of the world was prepared to rise at the signal. Germany, Italy, France, and all Australasia were labor countries, socialist states. They were ready to lend aid to the revolution. Gallantly they did, and it was for this reason when the Second Revolt was crushed that they too were crushed by the united oligarchies of the world, their socialist governments being replaced by oligarchical governments. You see, I am full of what is impending. I have lived it day and night, utterly and for so long that it is ever present in my mind. For that matter, I cannot think of my husband without thinking of it. He was the soul of it, and how can I possibly separate the two in thought? As I have said, there is much light that I alone can throw upon his character. It is well known that he toiled hard for liberty and suffered sore. How hard he toiled and how greatly he suffered I well know, for I have been with him during these 20 anxious years, and I know his patience, his untiring effort, his infinite devotion to the cause for which only 2 months agone he laid down his life. I shall try to write simply, and to tell here how Ernest Everhard entered my life, how I first met him, how he grew until I became a part of him, and the tremendous changes he wrought in my life. In this way, may you look at him through my eyes and learn him as I learned him, in all save the things too secret and sweet for me to tell. It was in February 1912 that I first met him, when, as a guest of my father's at dinner, he came to our house in Berkeley. I cannot say that my very first impression of him was favorable. He was one of many at dinner, and in the drawing-room where we gathered and waited for all to arrive, he made a rather incongruous appearance. It was preacher's night, as my father privately called it, and Ernest was certainly out of place in the midst of the churchmen. John Cunningham, Avis Everhard's father, was a professor at the State University at Berkeley, California. His chosen field was physics, and in addition he did much original research and was greatly distinguished as a scientist. His chief contribution to science was his studies of the electron and his monumental work on the identification of matter and energy, wherein he established beyond cavil and for all time that the ultimate unit of matter and the ultimate unit of force were identical. This idea had been earlier advanced but not demonstrated by Sir Oliver Lodge and other students in the field of radioactivity. In the first place, his clothes did not fit him. He wore a ready-made suit of dark cloth that was ill-adjusted to his body. In fact, no ready-made suit of clothes ever could fit his body. And on this night, as always, the cloth bulged with his muscles, while the coat between his shoulders, what of the heavy shoulder development, was a maze of wrinkles. His neck was the neck of a prize-fighter, thick and strong. So this was the social philosopher and ex-horseshoer my father had discovered, was my thought. And he certainly looked it, with those bulging muscles and that bull throat. Immediately I classified him. A sort of prodigy, I thought, a blind Tom of the working class. In that day it was the custom of men to compete for purses of money. They fought with their hands. When one was beaten into insensibility or killed, the survivor took the money. This obscure reference applies to a blind Negro musician who took the world by storm in the latter half of the 19th century of the Christian era. And then, when he shook hands with me, his handshake was firm and strong, and he looked at me boldly with his black eyes. Too boldly, I thought. You see, I was a creature of environment, and at that time had strong class instincts. Such boldness on the part of a man of my own class would have been almost unforgivable. I know that I could not avoid dropping my eyes, and I was quite relieved when I passed him on and turned to greet Bishop Morehouse, a favorite of mine, a sweet and serious man of middle age, Christ-like in appearance and goodness, and a scholar as well. But this boldness that I took to be presumption was a vital clue to the nature of Ernest Everhard. He was simple, direct, afraid of nothing, and he refused to waste time on conventional mannerisms. "You pleased me," he explained long afterward, "and why should I not fill my eyes with that which pleases me?" I have said that he was afraid of nothing. He was a natural aristocrat, and this in spite of the fact that he was in the camp of the non-aristocrats. He was a superman, a blond beast such as Nietzsche has described, and in addition he was aflame with democracy. Friedrich Nietzsche, the mad philosopher of the 19th century of the Christian era, who caught wild glimpses of truth, but who, before he was done, reasoned himself around the great circle of human thought and off into madness. In the interest of meeting the other guests, and what of my unfavorable impression, I forgot all about the working-class philosopher, though once or twice at table I noticed him, especially the twinkle in his eye as he listened to the talk first of one minister and then of another. He has humor, I thought. I almost forgave him his clothes. But the time went by, and the dinner went by, and he never opened his mouth to speak, while the ministers talked interminably about the working class and its relation to the church, and what the church had done and was doing for it. I noticed that my father was annoyed because Ernest did not talk. Once father took advantage of a lull and asked him to say something, but Ernest shrugged his shoulders, and with an "I have nothing to say," went on eating salted almonds. But father was not to be denied. After a while, he said, "We have with us a member of the working class. I am sure that he can present things from a new point of view that will be interesting and refreshing. I refer to Mr. Everhard." The others betrayed a well-mannered interest and urged Ernest for a statement of his views. Their attitude toward him was so broadly tolerant and kindly that it was really patronizing, and I saw that Ernest noted it and was amused. He looked slowly about him, and I saw the glint of laughter in his eyes. "I am not versed in the courtesies of ecclesiastical controversy," he began, and then hesitated with modesty and indecision. "Go on," they urged, and Dr. Hammerfield said, "We do not mind the truth that is in any man, if it is sincere," he amended. "Then you separate sincerity from truth?" Ernest laughed quickly. Dr. Hammerfield gasped and managed to answer, "The best of us may be mistaken, young man, the best of us." Ernest's manner changed on the instant. He became another man. "All right, then," he answered. "And let me begin by saying that you are all mistaken. You know nothing, and worse than nothing, about the working class. Your sociology is as vicious and worthless as is your method of thinking." It was not so much what he said as how he said it. I roused at the first sound of his voice. It was as bold as his eyes. It was a clarion call that thrilled me. And the whole table was aroused, shaken alive from monotony and drowsiness. "What is so dreadfully vicious and worthless in our method of thinking, young man?" Dr. Hammerfield demanded, and already there was something unpleasant in his voice and manner of utterance. "You are metaphysicians. You can prove anything by metaphysics, and have done so. Every metaphysician can prove every other metaphysician wrong, to his own satisfaction. You are anarchists in the realm of thought, and you are mad cosmos makers. Each of you dwells in a cosmos of his own making, created out of his own fancies and desires. You do not know the real world in which you live, and your thinking has no place in the real world, except insofar as it is phenomena for mental aberration. Do you know what I was reminded of as I sat at table and listened to you talk and talk? You reminded me for all the world of the scholastics of the Middle Ages who gravely and learnedly debated the absorbing question of how many angels could dance on the point of a needle. Why, my dear sirs, you are as remote from the intellectual life of the 20th century as an Indian medicine man making incantation in the primeval forest 10,000 years ago." As Ernest talked, he seemed in a fine passion. His face glowed, his eyes snapped and flashed, and his chin and jaw were eloquent with aggressiveness. But it was only a way he had. It always aroused people. His smashing, sledgehammer manner of attack invariably made them forget themselves. And they were forgetting themselves now. Bishop Morehouse was leaning forward and listening intently. Exasperation and anger were flushing the face of Dr. Hammerfield, and others were exasperated too, and some were smiling in an amused and superior way. As for myself, I found it most enjoyable. I glanced at father, and I was afraid he was going to giggle at the effect of this human bombshell he had been guilty of launching amongst us. "Your terms are rather vague," Dr. Hammerfield interrupted. "Just precisely what do you mean when you call us metaphysicians?" "I call you metaphysicians because you reason metaphysically," Ernest went on. "Your method of reasoning is the opposite to that of science. There is no validity to your conclusions. You can prove everything and nothing, and no two of you can agree upon anything. Each of you goes into his own consciousness to explain himself and the universe. As well may you lift yourselves by your own bootstraps as to explain consciousness by consciousness." "I do not understand," Bishop Morehouse said. "It seems to me that all things of the mind are metaphysical. The most exact and convincing of all sciences, mathematics, is sheerly metaphysical. Each and every thought process of the scientific reasoner is metaphysical. Surely you will agree with me." "As you say, you do not understand," Ernest replied. "The metaphysician reasons deductively out of his own subjectivity. The scientist reasons inductively from the facts of experience. The metaphysician reasons from theory to facts. The scientist reasons from facts to theory. The metaphysician explains the universe by himself. The scientist explains himself by the universe." "Thank God we are not scientists," Dr. Hammerfield murmured complacently. "What are you, then?" Ernest demanded. "Philosophers." "There you go," Ernest laughed. "You have left the real and solid earth and are up in the air with a word for a flying machine. Pray come down to earth and tell me precisely what you mean by philosophy." "Philosophy is—" Dr. Hammerfield paused and cleared his throat. "Something that cannot be defined comprehensively except to such minds and temperaments as are philosophical. The narrow scientist with his nose in a test tube cannot understand philosophy." Ernest ignored the thrust. It was always his way to turn the point back upon an opponent, and he did it now with a beaming brotherliness of face and utterance. "Then you will undoubtedly understand the definition I shall now make of philosophy. But before I make it, I shall challenge you to point out error in it or to remain a silent metaphysician. Philosophy is merely the widest science of all. Its reasoning method is the same as that of any particular science and of all particular sciences. And by that same method of reasoning, the inductive method, philosophy fuses all particular sciences into one great science. As Spencer says, the data of any particular science are partially unified knowledge. Philosophy unifies a knowledge that is contributed by all the sciences. Philosophy is the science of science, the master science, if you please. How do you like my definition?" Very creditable, Dr. Hammerfield muttered lamely. But Ernest was merciless. "Remember," he warned, "my definition is fatal to metaphysics. If you do not now point out a flaw in my definition, you are disqualified later on from advancing metaphysical arguments. You must go through life seeking that flaw and remaining metaphysically silent until you have found it." Ernest waited. The silence was painful. Dr. Hammerfield was pained. He was also puzzled. Ernest's sledgehammer attack disconcerted him. He was not used to the simple and direct method of controversy. He looked appealingly around the table, but no one answered for him. I caught father grinning into his napkin. "There is another way of disqualifying the metaphysicians," Ernest said, when he had rendered Dr. Hammerfield's discomfiture complete. "Judge them by their works. What have they done for mankind beyond the spinning of airy fancies and the mistaking of their own shadows for gods? They have added to the gaiety of mankind, I grant, but what tangible good have they wrought for mankind? They philosophized, if you will pardon my misuse of the word, about the heart as the seat of the emotions, while the scientists were formulating the circulation of the blood. They declaimed about famine and pestilence as being scourges of God, while the scientists were building granaries and draining cities. They builded gods in their own shapes and out of their own desires, while the scientists were building roads and bridges. They were describing the Earth as the center of the universe, while the scientists were discovering America and probing space for the stars and the laws of the stars. In short, the metaphysicians have done nothing, absolutely nothing for mankind. Step by step, before the advance of science, they have been driven back. As fast as the ascertained facts of science have overthrown their subjective explanation of things, they have made their new subjective explanations of things, including explanations of the latest ascertained facts. And this, I doubt not, they will go on doing to the end of time. Gentlemen, a metaphysician is a medicine man. The difference between you and the Eskimo who makes a fur-clad, blubber-eating god is merely a difference of several thousand years of ascertained facts. That is all. Yet the thought of Aristotle ruled Europe for 12 centuries, Dr. Ballingford announced pompously, and Aristotle was a metaphysician. Dr. Ballingford glanced around the table and was rewarded by nods and smiles of approval. Your illustration is most unfortunate, Ernest replied. You refer to a very dark period in human history. In fact, we call that period the Dark Ages. A period wherein science was raped by the metaphysicians, wherein physics became a search for the philosopher's stone, wherein chemistry became alchemy and astronomy became astrology. Sorry the domination of Aristotle's thought. Dr. Ballingford looked pained. Then he brightened up and said, Granted this horrible picture you have drawn, yet you must confess that metaphysics was inherently potent insofar as it drew humanity out of this dark period and on into the illumination of the succeeding centuries. Metaphysics had nothing to do with it, Ernest retorted. What? Dr. Hammerfield cried. It was not the thinking and the speculation that led to the voyages of discovery? Ah, my dear sir, Ernest smiled. I thought you were disqualified. You have not yet picked out the flaw in my definition of philosophy. You are now on an unsubstantial basis. But it is the way of the metaphysicians, and I forgive you. No, I repeat, metaphysics had nothing to do with it. Bread and butter, silks and jewels, dollars and cents, and incidentally the closing up of the overland trade routes to India, were the things that caused the voyages of discovery. With the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the Turks blocked the way of the caravans to India. The traders of Europe had to find another route. Here was the original cause for the voyages of discovery. Columbus sailed to find a new route to the Indies. It is so stated in all the history books. Incidentally, new facts were learned about the nature, size, and form of the earth, and the Ptolemaic system went glimmering. Dr. Hammerfield snorted. You do not agree with me? Ernest queried. Then wherein am I wrong? I can only reaffirm my position, Dr. Hammerfield retorted tartly. It is too long a story to enter into now. No story is too long for the scientist, Ernest said sweetly. That is why the scientist gets to places. That is why he got to America. I shall not describe the whole evening, though it is a joy to me to recall every moment, every detail of those first hours of my coming to know Ernest Everhard. Battle royal raged, and the ministers grew red-faced and excited, especially at the moments when Ernest called them romantic philosophers, shadow projectors, and similar things. And always he checked them back to facts. The fact, man, the irrefragable fact, he would proclaim triumphantly when he had brought one of them a cropper. He bristled with facts. He tripped them up with facts, ambuscaded them with facts, bombarded them with broadsides of facts. You seem to worship at the shrine of fact, Dr. Hammerfield taunted him. There is no God but fact, and Mr. Everhard is its prophet, Dr. Ballingford paraphrased. Ernest smilingly acquiesced. I'm like the man from Texas, he said. And on being solicited, he explained, You see, the man from Missouri always says, You've got to show me. But the man from Texas says, You've got to put it in my hand, from which it is apparent that he is no metaphysician. Another time, when Ernest had just said that the metaphysical philosophers could never stand the test of truth, Dr. Hammerfield suddenly demanded, What is the test of truth, young man? Will you kindly explain what has so long puzzled wiser heads than yours? Certainly, Ernest answered. His cocksureness irritated them. The wise heads have puzzled so sorely over truth because they went up into the air after it. Had they remained on the solid earth, they would have found it easily enough. Aye, they would have found that they themselves were precisely testing truth with every practical act and thought of their lives. The test, Dr. Hammerfield repeated impatiently. Never mind the preamble. Give us that which we have sought so long, the test of truth. Give it us, and we will be as gods. There was an impolite and sneering skepticism in his words and manner that secretly pleased most of them at the table, though it seemed to bother Bishop Morehouse. Dr. Jordan has stated it very clearly, Ernest said. His test of truth is, will it work? Will you trust your life with it? Note: a noted educator of the late 19th and early 20th centuries of the Christian era. He was president of the Stanford University, a private benefaction of the Times. Pish, Dr. Hammerfield sneered. You have not taken Bishop Berkeley into account. He has never been answered. Note: an idealistic monist who long puzzled the philosophers of that time with his denial of the existence of matter, but whose clever argument was finally demolished when the new empiric facts of science were philosophically generalized. The noblest metaphysician of them all, Ernest laughed. But your example is unfortunate, as Berkeley himself attested his metaphysics didn't work. Dr. Hammerfield was angry, righteously angry. It was as though he had caught Ernest in a theft or a lie. "Young man," he trumpeted, "that statement is on a par with all you have uttered tonight. It is a base and unwarranted assumption." "I'm quite crushed," Ernest murmured meekly. "Only I don't know what hit me. You'll have to put it in my hand, Doctor." I will," Dr. Hammerfield spluttered. "How do you know? You do not know that Bishop Berkeley attested that his metaphysics did not work. You have no proof. Young man, they have always worked." "I take it as proof that Berkeley's metaphysics did not work because—" Ernest paused calmly for a moment. "Because Berkeley made an invariable practice of going through doors instead of walls. Because he trusted his life to solid bread and butter and roast beef. Because he shaved himself with a razor that worked when it removed the hair from his face." "But those are actual things," Dr. Hammerfield cried. "Metaphysics is of the mind." "And they work? In the mind?" Ernest queried softly. The others nodded. "And even a multitude of angels can dance on the point of a needle. In the mind," Ernest went on reflectively. "And a blubber-eating, fur-clad god can exist and work. In the mind. And there are no proofs to the contrary. In the mind. I suppose, Doctor, you live in the mind?" "My mind, to me, a kingdom is," was the answer. "That's another way of saying that you live up in the air. But you come back to earth at mealtime, I am sure, or when an earthquake happens along. Or tell me, Doctor, do you have no apprehension in an earthquake that that incorporeal body of yours will be hit by an immaterial brick?" Instantly, and quite unconsciously, Dr. Hammerfield's hand shot up to his head, where a scar disappeared under the hair. It happened that Ernest had blundered on an apposite illustration. Dr. Hammerfield had nearly been killed in the great earthquake by a falling chimney. Everybody broke out in roars of laughter. Note: the great earthquake of 1906 A.D. that destroyed San Francisco. "Well?" Ernest asked, when the merriment had subsided. "Proofs to the contrary?" And in the silence he asked again, "Well?" Then he added, "Still well, but not so well, that argument of yours." But Dr. Hammerfield was temporarily crushed, and the battle raged on in new directions. On point after point, Ernest challenged the ministers. When they affirmed that they knew the working class, he told them fundamental truths about the working class that they did not know, and challenged them for disproofs. He gave them facts, always facts, checked their excursions into the air, and brought them back to the solid earth and its facts. How the scene comes back to me. I can hear him now with that war note in his voice, flaying them with his facts, each fact a lash that stung and stung again. And he was merciless. He took no quarter and gave none. I can never forget the flaying he gave them at the end. Note: this figure arises from the customs of the times, when, among men fighting to the death in their wild animal way, a beaten man threw down his weapons. It was at the option of the victor to slay him or spare him. "You have repeatedly confessed tonight by direct avowal or ignorant statement that you do not know the working class. But you are not to be blamed for this. How can you know anything about the working class? You do not live in the same locality with the working class. You herd with the capitalist class in another locality. And why not? It is the capitalist class that pays you, that feeds you, that puts the very clothes on your backs that you are wearing tonight. And in return, you preach to your employers the brand of metaphysics that are especially acceptable to them. And the especially acceptable brands are acceptable because they do not menace the established order of society." Here there was a stir of dissent around the table. "Oh, I'm not challenging your sincerity," Ernest continued. "You are sincere. You preach what you believe. There lies your strength and your value to the capitalist class. But should you change your belief to something that menaces the established order, your preaching would be unacceptable to your employers and you would be discharged. Every little while, some one or another of you is so discharged. Am I not right? Note: during this period, there were many ministers cast out of the church for preaching unacceptable doctrine. Especially were they cast out when their preaching became tainted with socialism. This time there was no dissent. They sat dumbly acquiescent, with the exception of Dr. Hammerfield, who said, "It is when their thinking is wrong that they are asked to resign," which is another way of saying when their thinking is unacceptable, Ernest answered, and then went on. "So I say to you, go ahead and preach and earn your pay, but for goodness' sake leave the working class alone. You belong in the enemy's camp. You have nothing in common with the working class. Your hands are soft with the work others have performed for you. Your stomachs are round with the plenitude of eating." Here Dr. Ballingford winced, and every eye glanced at his prodigious girth. It was said he had not seen his own feet in years. "And your minds are filled with doctrines that are buttresses of the established order. You are as much mercenaries, sincere mercenaries, I grant, as were the men of the Swiss Guard. Be true to your salt and your hire. Guard with your preaching the interests of your employers, but do not come down to the working class and serve as false leaders. You cannot honestly be in the two camps at once. The working class has done without you. Believe me, the working class will continue to do without you. And, furthermore, the working class can do better without you than with you." Note: the hired foreign palace guards of Louis XIV, the King of France that was beheaded by his people. End of Chapter 1. Recording by Matt Soar, Montreal, mattsoar.org. Chapter 2 of The Iron Heel by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Matt Soar. Challenges. After the guests had gone, father threw himself into a chair and gave vent to roars of gargantuan laughter. Not since the death of my mother had I known him to laugh so heartily. "I'll wager Dr. Hammerfield was never up against anything like it in his life," he laughed. "The courtesies of ecclesiastical controversy. Did you notice how he began like a lamb? Everhard, I mean, and how quickly he became a roaring lion? He has a splendidly disciplined mind. He would have made a good scientist if his energies had been directed that way." I need scarcely say that I was deeply interested in Ernest Everhard. It was not alone what he had said and how he had said it, but it was the man himself. I had never met a man like him. I suppose that was why, in spite of my 24 years, I had not married. I liked him. I had to confess it to myself. And my like for him was founded on things beyond intellect and argument. Regardless of his bulging muscles and prize-fighter's throat, he impressed me as an ingenious boy. I felt that under the guise of an intellectual swashbuckler was a delicate and sensitive spirit. I sensed this in ways I knew not, save that they were my woman's intuitions. There was something in that clarion call of his that went to my heart. It still rang in my ears, and I felt that I should like to hear it again, and to see again that glint of laughter in his eyes that belied the impassioned seriousness of his face. And there were further reaches of vague and indeterminate feelings that stirred in me. I almost loved him then, though I am confident, had I never seen him again, that the vague feelings would have passed away, and I should easily have forgotten him. But I was not destined never to see him again. My father's newborn interest in sociology and the dinner parties he gave would not permit. Father was not a sociologist. His marriage with my mother had been very happy, and in the researches of his own science, physics, he had been very happy. That when my mother died, his own work could not fill the emptiness. At first, in a mild way, he had dabbled in philosophy. Then, becoming interested, he had drifted on into economics and sociology. He had a strong sense of justice, and he soon became fired with a passion to redress wrong. It was with gratitude that I hailed these signs of a new interest in life, though I little dreamed what the outcome would be. With the enthusiasm of a boy, he plunged excitedly into these new pursuits, regardless of whither they led him. He had been used always to the laboratory, and so it was that he turned the dining room into a sociological laboratory. Here came to dinner all sorts and conditions of men: scientists, politicians, bankers, merchants, professors, labor leaders, socialists, and anarchists. He stirred them to discussion and analyzed their thoughts of life and society. He had met Ernest shortly prior to the preacher's night, And after the guests were gone, I learned how he had met him, passing down a street at night and stopping to listen to a man on a soapbox who was addressing a crowd of working men. The man on the box was Ernest. Not that he was a mere soapbox orator. He stood high in the councils of the Socialist Party, was one of the leaders, and was the acknowledged leader in the philosophy of socialism. But he had a certain clear way of stating the abstruse in simple language, was a born expositor and teacher, and was not above the soapbox as a means of interpreting economics to the working men. My father stopped to listen, became interested, effected a meeting, and, after quite an acquaintance, invited him to the minister's dinner. It was after the dinner that father told me what little he knew about him. He had been born in the working class, though he was a descendant of the old line of Everhards that for over 200 years had lived in America. Note: the distinction between being native-born and foreign-born was sharp and invidious in those days. At 10 years of age, he had gone to work in the mills, and later he served his apprenticeship and became a horseshoer. He was self-educated, had taught himself German and French, and at that time was earning a meager living by translating scientific and philosophical works for a struggling socialist publishing house in Chicago. Also, his earnings were added to by the royalties from the small sales of his own economic and philosophic works. This much I learned of him before I went to bed, and I lay long awake listening in memory to the sound of his voice. I grew frightened at my thoughts. He was so unlike the men of my own class, so alien and so strong. His masterfulness delighted me and terrified me, for my fancies wantonly roved until I found myself considering him as a lover, as a husband. I had always heard that the strength of men was an irresistible attraction to women, but he was too strong. "No, no," I cried out. "It is impossible, absurd." And on the morrow I awoke to find in myself a longing to see him again. I wanted to see him mastering men in discussion, the war note in his voice. To see him, in all his certitude and strength, shattering their complacency, shaking them out of their ruts of thinking. What if he did swashbuckle? To use his own phrase, it worked. It produced effects. And besides, his swashbuckling was a fine thing to see. It stirred one like the onset of battle. Several days passed during which I read Ernest's books borrowed from my father. His written word was as his spoken word, clear and convincing. It was its absolute simplicity that convinced even while one continued to doubt. He had the gift of lucidity. He was the perfect expositor. Yet, in spite of his style, there was much that I did not like. He laid too great a stress on what he called the class struggle, the antagonism between labor and capital, the conflict of interest. Father reported with glee Dr. Hammerfield's judgment of Ernest, which was to the effect that he was "an insolent young puppy made bumptious by a little and very inadequate learning." Also, Dr. Hammerfield declined to meet Ernest again. But Bishop Morehouse turned out to have become interested in Ernest and was anxious for another meeting. "A strong young man," he said, "and very much alive, but he is too sure, too sure." Ernest came one afternoon with father. The bishop had already arrived, and we were having tea on the veranda. Ernest's continued presence in Berkeley, by the way, was accounted for by the fact that he was taking special courses in biology at the university, and also that he was hard at work on a new book entitled Philosophy and Revolution. Note: this book continued to be secretly printed throughout the 3 centuries of the Iron Heel. There are several copies of various editions in the National Library of Ardis. The veranda seemed suddenly to have become small when Ernest arrived. Not that he was so very large, he stood only 5 feet 9 inches, but that he seemed to radiate an atmosphere of largeness. As he stopped to meet me, he betrayed a certain slight awkwardness that was strangely at variance with his bold-looking eyes and his firm, sure hand that clasped for a moment in greeting. And in that moment his eyes were just as steady and sure. There seemed a question in them this time, and as before he looked at me overlong. "I've been reading your working-class philosophy," I said, and his eyes lighted in a pleased way. "Of course," he answered. "You took into consideration the audience to which it was addressed." "I did, and it is because I did that I have a quarrel with you," I challenged. "I, too, have a quarrel with you, Mr. Everhard," Bishop Morehouse said. Ernest shrugged his shoulders whimsically and accepted a cup of tea. The bishop bowed and gave me precedence. "You foment class hatred," I said. "I consider it wrong and criminal to appeal to all that is narrow and brutal in the working class. Class hatred is antisocial, and it seems to me anti-socialistic." "Not guilty," he answered. Class hatred is neither in the text nor in the spirit of anything I have ever written."
"Ah!"
I cried reproachfully, and reached for his book and opened it. He sipped his tea and smiled at me while I ran over the pages. "Page 132, I read aloud. "The class struggle, therefore, presents itself in the present stage of social development between the wage-paying and the wage-paid classes." I looked at him triumphantly. "No mention there of class hatred," he smiled back. "But," I answered, "you say class struggle." "A different thing from class hatred," he replied. "And believe me, we foment no hatred. We say that the class struggle is a law of social development. We are not responsible for it. We do not make the class struggle. We merely explain it, as Newton explained gravitation. We explain the nature of the conflict of interest that produces the class struggle." "But there should be no conflict of interest," I cried. "I agree with you heartily," he answered. "That is what we socialists are trying to bring about, the abolition of the conflict of interest. Pardon me, let me read an extract." He took his book and turned back several pages. "Page 126. The cycle of class struggles which began with the dissolution of rude tribal communism and the rise of private property will end with the passing of private property in the means of social existence." "But I disagree with you," the Bishop interposed, his pale, ascetic face betraying by a faint glow the intensity of his feelings. "Your premise is wrong. There is no such thing as a conflict of interest between labor and capital, or rather there ought not to be." "Thank you," Ernest said gravely. "By that last statement you have given me back my premise." "But why should there be a conflict?" the Bishop demanded warmly. Ernest shrugged his shoulders. "Because we are so made, I guess." "But we are not so made," cried the other. "Are you discussing the ideal man?" Ernest asked. "Unselfish and godlike and so few in numbers as to be practically non-existent? Or are you discussing the common and ordinary average man?" "The common and ordinary man," was the answer. "Who is weak and fallible, prone to error?" Bishop Morehouse nodded. "And petty and selfish?" Again he nodded. "Watch out," Ernest warned. "I said selfish." "Well, the average man is selfish," the Bishop affirmed valiantly. "Wants all he can get, true but deplorable." "Then I've got you." Ernest's jaw snapped like a trap. "Let me show you. Here is a man who works on the street railways." "He couldn't work if it weren't for capital," the Bishop interrupted. "True, and you will grant that capital would perish if there were no labor to earn the dividends." The Bishop was silent. "Won't you?" Ernest insisted. The Bishop nodded. "Then our statements cancel each other," Ernest said in a matter-of-fact tone. "And we are where we were. Now to begin again. The working men on the street railway furnish the labor. The stockholders furnish the capital. By the joint effort of the working men and the capital, money is earned." Note: in those days, groups of predatory individuals controlled all the means of transportation, and for the use of same levied toll upon the public. "Very good," the Bishop interposed, "and there is no reason that the division should not be amicable." "You have already forgotten what we had agreed upon," Ernest replied. "We agreed that the average man is selfish. He is the man that is. You have gone up in the air and are arranging a division between the kind of men that ought to be, but are not. But to return to the earth, the working man, being selfish, wants all he can get in the division. The capitalist, being selfish, wants all he can get in the division. When there is only so much of the same thing, and when two men want all they can get out of the same thing, there is a conflict of interest between labor and capital. And it is an irreconcilable conflict. As long as working men and capitalists exist, they will continue to quarrel over the division. If you were in San Francisco this afternoon, you'd have to walk. There isn't a streetcar running." "Another strike?" the Bishop queried with alarm. Note: these quarrels were very common in those irrational and anarchic times. Sometimes the laborers refused to work. Sometimes the capitalists refused to let the laborers work. In the violence and turbulence of such disagreements, much property was destroyed and many lives lost. All this is inconceivable to us, as inconceivable as another custom of that time, namely the habit the men of the lower classes had of breaking the furniture when they quarreled with their wives. Yes, they're quarreling over the division of the earnings of the street railways. Bishop Morehouse became excited. "It is wrong," he cried. "It is so short-sighted on the part of the working men. How can they hope to keep our sympathy?" "When we are compelled to walk," Ernest said slyly. But Bishop Morehouse ignored him and went on. "Their outlook is too narrow. Men should be men, not brutes. There will be violence and murder now, and sorrowing widows and orphans. Capital and labor should be friends. They should work hand in hand to their mutual benefit." "Ah, now you are up in the air again," Ernest remarked dryly. "Come back to earth. Remember, we agreed that the average man is selfish." "But he ought not to be," the bishop cried. "And there I agree with you," was Ernest's rejoinder. "He ought not to be selfish, but he will continue to be selfish as long as he lives in a social system that is based on pig ethics." The bishop was aghast, and my father chuckled. "Yes, pig ethics," Ernest went on remorselessly. "That is the meaning of the capitalist system. And that is what your church is standing for, what you are preaching for every time you get up in the pulpit. Pig ethics. There is no other name for it." Bishop Morehouse turned appealingly to my father, but he laughed and nodded his head. "I'm afraid Mr. Everhard is right," he said. "Laissez-faire, the let-alone policy of each for himself and devil take the hindmost. As Mr. Everhard said the other night, the function you churchmen perform is to maintain the established order of society, and society is established on that foundation." "But that is not the teaching of Christ!" cried the bishop. "The church is not teaching Christ these days," Ernest put in quickly. "That is why the working men will have nothing to do with the church. The church condones the frightful brutality and savagery with which the capitalist class treats the working class." "The church does not condone it," the bishop objected. "The church does not protest against it," Ernest replied. "And insofar as the church does not protest, it condones. For remember, the church is supported by the capitalist class." "I had not looked at it in that light," the bishop said naively. "You must be wrong. I know that there is much that is sad and wicked in this world. I know that the church has lost what you call the proletariat." Note: proletariat, derived originally from the Latin proletari, the name given in the census of Servius Tullius to those who were of value to the state only as the rearers of offspring, proles. In other words, they were of no importance either for wealth or position or exceptional ability. "You never had the proletariat," Ernest cried. "The proletariat has grown up outside the church and without the church." "I do not follow you," the bishop said faintly. "Then let me explain. With the introduction of machinery and the factory system in the latter part of the 18th century, the great mass of the working people was separated from the land. The old system of labor was broken down. The working people were driven from their villages and herded in factory towns. The mothers and children were put to work at the new machines. Family life ceased. The conditions were frightful. It is a tale of blood." I know," Bishop Morehouse interrupted with an agonized expression on his face. "It was terrible, but it occurred a century and a half ago." "And there, a century and a half ago, originated the modern proletariat," Ernest continued, "and the church ignored it. While a slaughterhouse was made of the nation by the capitalists, the church was dumb. It did not protest as today it does not protest. As Austin Lewis says, speaking of that time, those to whom the command, 'Feed my lambs,' had been given, saw those lambs sold into slavery and worked to death without a protest. The church was dumb then, and before I go on, I want you either flatly to agree with me or flatly to disagree with me. Was the church dumb then?" Note: Austin Lewis was candidate for governor of California on the socialist ticket in the fall election of 1906 Christian era. An Englishman by birth, a writer of many books on political economy and philosophy, and one of the socialist leaders of the times. Note: there is no more horrible page in history than the treatment of the child and women slaves in the English factories in the latter half of the 18th century of the Christian era. In such industrial hells arose some of the proudest fortunes of that day. Bishop Morehouse hesitated. Like Dr. Hammerfield, he was unused to this fierce infighting, as Ernest called it. "The history of the 18th century is written," Ernest prompted. "If the church was not dumb, it will be found not dumb in the books." "I am afraid the church was dumb," the bishop confessed. "And the church is dumb today." "There I disagree," said the bishop. Ernest paused, looking at him searchingly, and accepted the challenge. "All right," he said. "Let us see. In Chicago, there are women who toil all the week for 90 cents. Has the church protested?" "This is news to me," was the answer. 90 cents per week. It's horrible." "Has the church protested?" Ernest insisted. "The church does not know." The bishop was struggling hard. "Yet the command to the church was, 'Feed my